cooperation through the United Nations and helped to sponsor the series of papers, one of which we're going to hear about this afternoon. Let me start by thanking IRI for hosting us here today in this great facility, and especially to Lorne and Ken Wollack for doing the heavy lifting in writing the paper that you're going to get to hear about. This paper is one of 9 that the Better World Campaign commissioned over the last year or so to explore America's interest in international cooperation. There are other papers on a range of issues from proliferation to terrorism to peacekeeping to climate change. But all of them have the same underlying premise, which is that in today's interdependent world, international cooperation can serve the interests of the United States and the rest of the world in addressing a number of great global challenges. Today's topic, democracy, cuts across that agenda in a variety of fundamental ways. Human rights and the ability of people to vote and have systems of rules and accountability are essential to nations working together and to making progress on the global agenda. The interest of the Better World Campaign in democracy stems in part from the UN's role in democracy promotion and advancing democracy around the world. I think we all know that the UN is imperfect, but it does some things very well, from global health and humanitarian relief to peacekeeping and democracy building. The UN plays a critical role, I think, in a variety of places in maintaining peace, facilitating post-conflict reconciliation, and helping with the reconstruction and the delicate transition to democratic governance. Too few people in this country probably recognize that almost half of the world's nations have requested and received UN assistance in the conduct of elections, and that's a representation of the broad-based role that the UN plays around the world in advancing democracy. But of course, the UN can't and shouldn't do it alone, and that's why U.S. leadership is indispensable to advancing democracy. And that's why we're so delighted that Lorne and Ken have taken the time to put together a variety of ideas about how a new administration can continue the United States' efforts to advance democracy around the world. What we're going to do is have a presentation of the underpinnings of this report and the recommendations of this report. And to guide us through that, we have a distinguished member of America's Foreign Service, Ambassador Ron Newman, who's the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He's had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service in Washington and around the world, including ambassadorial stints in Bahrain, Algeria, and most recently in Afghanistan. So to get us started and oversee this discussion, I turn it to Ambassador Newman.
Thank you. It's a pleasure, having worked a good deal with both of my colleagues here and their organizations various times. I wanted to start off by, in a sense, looking at the context in which this discussion is going on today, because there's a lot of talk about whether we've pushed too far for democracy, about whether we should do more stability policy. And what I really want to suggest is that the stability versus democracy dichotomy is false and sterile on both sides. There is no absolute stability, first of all. The historical problems of dictatorship, like monarchies, is that they have no succession mechanism to deal with a bad ruler. So at some point, what looks stable becomes unstable, even if you really liked it. If Hamas is threatening, there is no salvation in backing a weak, corrupt Fatah leadership in the progressive loss of Palestinian support. Many problems are there, but democracy is not at the top of that list, and it shouldn't be made a scapegoat. for other failures. And then when you look at, well, should we just go back to stability, things change. Two examples: Pakistan, when Musharraf took charge and you had a really corrupt system that was theoretically democratic, but in which the military carried more weight than the politicians, and the political system itself was badly corrupted, there was actually a lot of support and perhaps a lot of reason for support for that change. And there was a lot of reason to support Musharraf after the 9/11 attack. But as he lost popularity, our policy of supporting him dragged the U.S. down along with Musharraf, so that now we are finding it much harder to straddle two goals of building cooperation in counterinsurgency and supporting democratic government. And it also exemplifies the fact that we don't have the luxury of choosing only one goal. We must have cooperation while we have Americans dying in a war in Afghanistan, and we need to support democracy for long-term stability in Pakistan, or we may have a much larger war later. Another brief example, the Philippines. When Marcos lost popularity and basically the Philippine people very heavily rose up against him, it would have been politically impossible in the U.S. to stick with him, and it would have been a disaster in international politics had we tried, in the Philippines, had we tried to do so. It's again simply the example that you don't get to have one policy and stick to it. And there is real demand in much of the world for representation, going back to David's point about the number of elections. We cannot cut that off. We shouldn't want to, but we can't in any event. And as the examples show, we have real risks of being on the wrong side of history if we hold only to stability, and leaving the field to demagogues and extremists, particularly in the Middle East. But if stability offers no constant policy guidance, neither, I fear, does democracy as a single word policy, particularly not if it is understood in terms of elections and transforming everyone right away. What Ken and Lorne have said about democracy in terms of development, stability, economic progress is all true for mature democracies. But it's not as assured for new democracies. Too rapid elections can lead to ethnic polarization and even violence. Weak democratic governments with unstable majorities can be the least able to make the decisions necessary for economic growth. Korea is a fascinating example when you look back in history after the war, because neither the Syngman Rhee government, busily solidifying its popular support, nor a very weak democratic government which followed it were able to make a host of decisions on land reform, currency reform, and others which were critical to setting Korea on the path to being the economic tiger that it became. That came about because you had both a strong and a competent dictatorial regime, which then, of course, ceased to be, over time, either competent or stable. It's not to say autocracies work, it's just to say that democracy is not a panacea. Elections can become a referendum for leadership that has little to do with democracy. Of course, the most extreme example of that is electing Hitler. Some might argue that Chavez is beginning to go down a similar path, but I'm not a Latin American expert, and I won't take on that argument. If it appears from my remarks that this is a difference with Ken and Lorne, I don't think it actually is. And I've worked with them a good deal. Ken remembers my pushing hard to get people from NDI to take some real risk to come out to Algeria to help press for a more democratic result in an election as we worked together in Bahrain. We worked extensively with IRI in Afghanistan and to some extent in Iraq. The reality is simply that the discussion is much more complicated than stability versus democracy. It's about how to make a democracy stable, how to build a liberal democratic culture, how to grow the seeds from which these things can sprout, when to switch all-out support without trying to make policy with a cookie cutter, and above all, I would say how to balance and advance multiple goals, because my final thought is that no nation has the luxury of a single issue policy, and certainly not the United States. And now we get to the real meat of the meeting, and over to you guys.
Thank you, Ron. First, I want to begin by thanking David and the Better World campaign for organizing this event and for asking NDI and IRI to participate in the campaign's series of papers developed for the presidential campaign and the incoming administration. At a time when democracy promotion is portrayed by critics as simply a U.S. export, some might be surprised that an organization dedicated to the work of the United Nations would choose this topic among a handful of others in offering strategies for enhancing international cooperation. However, it is not surprising to us. As David noted, over the past 2 decades, the United Nations, along with other intergovernmental organizations, donor aid agencies, and even international financial institutions, have come to understand the linkages between democracy and development. In the landmark, some would say revolutionary, 2002 Human Development Report, the United Nations Development Program asserted boldly that democratic participation is a critical end of human development, not just a means of achieving it. The report took the democracy agenda one step further by declaring that democratic politics is as important to successful development as economics. Today, nearly 50% of the UNDP's budget is dedicated to democracy and governance programs. Other UN agencies and bureaus are also deeply engaged in these issues. They include the Electoral Assistance Bureau, UNIFEM, and the UN Democracy Fund, which was established just 3 years ago. It is ironic, therefore, that at a time when democracy and liberal principles often govern the discourse between and within nations, and even when many autocrats who cling to power find it necessary to speak the democratic idiom, that democracy promotion should be such a controversial topic at home. That is why Lorne and I were so grateful to the Better World campaign for giving us the opportunity to return to our roots, to explain what we consider the fundamentals of these issues and what we have learned in 25 years. And in the words of one congressional staffer, to push the reset button. Lorne and I recognize that in some circles, democracy and our efforts to support its development overseas have become a pejorative. We have participated in this debate throughout 2007, when we and our respective staffs traveled together to World Affairs Councils in some 30 cities across the country. And I will say, by the end of each discussion, I can say proudly that we won most of the audiences over to our side, but it took an entire evening. The arguments against would be familiar to this audience, and we can explore this further in the discussion period. But they are dominated by the Iraq War, by the election results in Palestine, and views on the Bush presidency. So let me, just for a few minutes, go over some of the fundamentals which are often overlooked in the fog of the debate and misinformation on this issue, and which we try to address in the paper. In the last half century, since the U.S. has become a superpower, we have viewed the world through an ever-changing series of foreign policy optics. Either our own political process or international challenges, or both, have conspired to bring about each change. During the 1980s, we began another such change, this one less the discovery of something new than the return to an optic once widely admired for the clarity of purpose with which we saw ourselves and the world. In this sense, the new democratization optic was less of a redirection than a reaffirmation. It can be traced back to the preamble to the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, to the Congressional Declaration in 1973 that promoting the increased observation of internationally recognized human rights by all countries was to be a principal goal of American foreign policy, to President Carter's determination that international human rights be the cornerstone of his foreign policy, and President Reagan, in a 1983 speech at Westminster, broadened the emphasis from a concern for individual victims of governmental abuse to a commitment to foster and develop democracy. That speech led to the creation of the National Endowment for Democracy and our two institutes. In President Bill Clinton's national security doctrine, democracy promotion was one of the three pillars of U.S. foreign policy, and democracy was mentioned more than 100 times in the paper. It is no longer possible to know precisely to what extent these efforts preceded, stimulated, or were themselves fostered by the profound global changes that began in the late 1970s with the democratic increase in the number of democracies worldwide. American foreign policy may have been a catalyst for this democratic surge, but the post-war recovery of major democracies in Europe and Japan also contributed to a wider appreciation for the democratic form of social management. The return of democracy in Spain and Portugal in the mid-1970s greatly influenced the democratic revolution in Latin America a decade later. Increased travel, cultural, educational exchange programs, trade patterns, all indicators of interdependence, have conspired to create interest in systems permitting more freedom of choice for individual citizens. The strong trend towards democracy in the 1980s reinforced the theory that human nature will ultimately seek some form of free expression. A turning point, I believe, for the U.S. came during the 1980s, when an important lesson was learned about political transformation in countries like Chile, Nicaragua, and the Philippines. That political forces on the far left and the far right enjoyed a mutually reinforcing relationship, drawing strength from each other and in the process marginalizing the democratic center. And we are seeing this played out in many places in the Middle East currently. Prospects for peace and stability only emerged once democratic political parties and civic groups were able to offer a viable alternative to the two extremes. And in this regard, in the U.S., Republicans and Democrats joined forces to champion this cause. And even the traditional economic development community began to reassess. For a decade, it was hoped that economic aid could achieve the kind of economic growth and opportunity in the developing world that leads to social stability. Even when successful, this emphasis on economic growth often lost momentum because it was not accompanied by political growth. It became increasingly apparent that an ever-growing number of problems were beyond the reach of traditional economic aid because while they have economic consequences, they are intrinsically political problems. Truly sustainable development requires the capacity to resolve problems without a resort to violence or repression. Now there were and continue to be the naysayers, those who argue that social development must come first and democracy evolve from a middle class and the gradual creation of liberal institutions. In this argument, international engagement, therefore, must focus on what people need and want most: jobs, education, housing, and food. And there is, I would argue, a certain hubris in this view, that wanting to put food on the table and having a say in the political issues that affect your life are somehow mutually exclusive or can be sequenced. That we, first person plural is often used, meaning I assume the United States or the international community, are somehow in control of events, that we can manage and calibrate the pace and nature of change in these countries. I am also reminded of a cable written by a respected U.S. diplomat a decade ago, who reminded his colleagues that our sole focus on economic development was once the rationale for 2 generations of dictators in the developing world. Only a few followed good economic policies. For every Lee Kuan Yew or Park Chung-hee, there were many others: Toure, Marcos, Banda, Nimeri, the Argentine and Nigerian juntas. In addition to committing large-scale human rights abuses, these leaders ran their economies into the ground and failed to provide the institutional means to address societal divisions, which is why they rose so violently in their wake. The problem with even an enlightened authoritarian leader, this diplomat wrote, is that blinded by economic success, hubris takes over along with greed. His or her rule is perpetuated and corruption grows. For those who have dealt with these issues on the ground for the past 25 years, we have learned, not surprisingly, that we must and we are expected to be engaged in the political and economic arena simultaneously. Politics and economics are today inexorably linked, and in many places, people are in a demanding mood on both fronts. It was only months ago that we watched hundreds of thousands of courageous Pakistanis marching to restore the independence of the judiciary in their country. And only elections were the way out of a growing crisis. Now, I'll make a confession. All of us caught up in the euphoria of democratization's third wave operated perhaps almost on faith, on the premise that the challenges facing the poor were rooted in political systems where citizens were denied their political voice, where government systems had no obligation to answer to the people, and where special interests exploited resources without fear of oversight or the need to account to the public. Conversely, we argue that democratic rule encourages the development and delivery of policies and programs that reflect the popular will and address the issues that affect citizens' daily lives. Likewise, we saw democracies as including incentives and safeguards that allow citizens, even the poorest of the poor, to reward public officials who act in the public interest and hold accountable those who fail to address the needs of the many and not just the privileged few. While any form of government can provide security and deliver basic services, democratic states are better able to deliver these public goods by way of a participatory process where alternative viewpoints are considered and the interests of poor and marginalized communities are taken into account. So we thought. While democracy is an important goal in and of itself, perhaps it should not have surprised us that fledgling democratic states did not guarantee economic opportunities for all citizens, and that those that do not risk jeopardizing the entire democratic venture. And now we know that making democracy deliver has become the next generation of challenges to democracy. For us in the democracy community, it means helping political institutions work better to improve the quality of life for all citizens. As the late Bronislaw Geremek reminded us, and who died tragically only a few weeks ago, democracy is by no means, he said, a process that goes from triumph to triumph, nor is it exempt from creating the very conditions that undermine it. Therefore, I would conclude by quoting from a four-term New York governor and the Democratic candidate for president in 1928. Al Smith, who championed the cause of the tenements that he represented in the state assembly, once quipped that the only cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy. So while we continue to debate the future direction of U.S. foreign policy and the role of democracy promotion within that policy, we should not need to relearn the same lessons over and over again by experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Let me begin also by thanking the Better World campaign, and especially David. We were able to work together very, very well, and I think collaboratively have produced a pretty good product. I'm always happy to be on a stage with Ron Newman, who I've known for many, many years, as he said, in different iterations. And my good friend Ken Wollack always has good thoughts, as he just did. The last half of our paper, we emphasized basically three themes. First, the changes underway in the nature of democracy building, from an essentially U.S. enterprise with a little bit of German and British engagement to a much more multinational and multilateral effort. Second, the importance of better understanding of how NGOs, as opposed to governments, do this work. And third, necessary changes, we thought, in the internal architecture of the executive branch to help ensure more successful democracy building efforts. Some of those are arcane, and I'll get to them in a few minutes, but they can make a big difference. First, the changing nature of democracy building. As many of you know, and I see a lot of good friends, old friends around the room, This is my second time at IRI. A lot of people ask me about the differences between being here in the 90s and being here today. And it's certainly true that IRI is much larger. It's also true that we're in a lot of different, tougher, I would say, countries, places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sudan. But I would also say perhaps the biggest difference, the most important difference, is the number of partners we now have with whom to do this work. As I mentioned, in the 90s, we worked mostly with the Germans, on whom, by the way, IRI and NDI were modeled on their Stiftungs, and the British. But in this decade, for many of the reasons Ken emphasized, other countries and other institutions have come into this game. From the developed democracies, countries like Spain, Australia, and the Netherlands. Also joining this effort are institutes from new democracies, countries, ironically, where IRI and NDI once helped, places like Slovakia, Serbia, South Korea, Latvia, Lithuania, El Salvador, and elsewhere. Moreover, for the very same reasons that Ken elucidated, and as he stated, multilateral institutions like the UNDP, the OSCE, the Southern African Development Community, and others have begun or enlarged their efforts to advance democracy in member countries. There's a lot of chatter about whether the U.S. can work with others on democracy building. Both we and NDI and other U.S. NGOs are already doing it. With the UN, with regional institutions like the OSCE, with many more countries that don't come quickly to mind when considering democracy assistance, places like France, Thailand, Indonesia, El Salvador, and South Korea. We think that this fact, the new emphasis by other countries and institutions on democracy assistance, and the ever-increasing opportunities it affords for multilateral efforts, is an important consideration as the U.S. contemplates our own democracy-building efforts and strategies. The second point we make in the second half of the paper is the need for a better understanding of what democracy building is and isn't. Because this administration's renewed emphasis on democracy building happened to come at the same time as the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, there has arisen an assumption on the part of the American public that democracy building means war and regime change. At best, people think that democracy building has worked in Central Europe, but it can't work anywhere else. I've pointed out on a number of occasions that over the last 30 years, 80 countries have become more democratic. There's not 80 countries in Central Europe, and certainly we have not invaded 80 countries over the last 30 years. In fact, the number is 5. So clearly something else is going on. In our paper, Ken and I note the role that NGOs have played and can continue to play by emphasizing one important fact and 4 criteria that follow. First, as I said, regime change is not the goal or the objective of democracy assistance. There follows 4 criteria. First, our activities have to be grounded in international law. Second, and this is one of the most important, they have to grow out of the need and requests of Democrats in the country. They cannot be implanted. Third, we have to offer best practices, and here the changing multilateral nature of our work is very important. I always say you can't talk to George Washington or Thomas Jefferson anymore, but you can still talk to Lech Walesa or Nelson Mandela or Kim Dae-jung to find out how they very recently built their democracies. Third, or finally, our work should be conducted in the open and must only be undertaken with partners committed to pluralism and nonviolence. Keeping these rules in mind, along with an understanding, as Ken said, that elections are not the be-all and end-all of democracy building, and incorporating an attribute that is not very American, it's called patience, ensures that we are better able to assist others in gaining greater freedom. A public understanding of the way in which we actually operate would also lead to greater U.S. public support for our efforts. Third, necessary changes in the executive branch. We talked in the paper about the changes in the executive branch that should and should not occur in a new administration. First, what should change? Number 1, diplomatically, a greater emphasis on straightening out the UN's Human Rights Council or its replacement if it is incapable of functioning. The council, which was intended to better the record of the UN Human Rights Commission, has in fact been far worse than its predecessor. partly because of design flaws in the new council and partly because the U.S. has chosen, in part because of those design flaws, not to be engaged in its betterment. The new commission continues to limp along. We believe a greater U.S. diplomatic emphasis on bettering the council is warranted. Second, a greater emphasis on education on how to advance democracy and human rights within the Foreign Service. I found in my time at State that, contrary to conventional wisdom, U.S. diplomats are not, by and large, averse to trying to advance human rights and democracy, but that they often simply don't know how to do it. I spent a lot of my last tour at the State Department trying to offer that service. Diplomats need more education through the Foreign Service Institute on this topic, particularly understanding, as we've emphasized, that elections do not equal democracy. Some efforts have been taken recently in response to congressional pressure, but they are only halfway and insufficient. Finally, within AID, the work of the Democracy Office was bureaucratically downgraded at the beginning of this administration, and what little funding the office was getting was cut. That office should be upgraded to a bureau, and as at the State Department's Bureau of Democracy and Human Rights, funding should be devoted to the office so it can help undertake programming. We emphasize two areas that we do not believe should be changed. First, the last two administrations, Democrat and Republicans, have emphasized the importance of democracy building in their formal national security policies. We believe that should continue to send the message abroad and in our own bureaucracy that these issues continue to be, as they have been since the Carter administration's, formal foreign policy goals. Second, there's been much talk about consolidating democracy funding within exclusively AID or state or the National Endowment for Democracy. We believe that the diversity of funding and viewpoints, which has increased in this administration with the Middle East Partnership Initiative, the Millennium Challenge account, and a revitalized Bureau for Democracy and Human Rights, all of that should continue. A diversity of sources, each with its own strengths, best serves a policy of advancing democracy. As my friend Ken Wollack says, we don't need a central committee for pluralism. That concludes our presentation. I know Ron will begin with some questions for us, and then he's going to throw it open. Thank you.
We actually did conspire a little bit before. Even democracy requires conspiracy. And thought there were a couple of questions that we thought we could open up here in a bit of discussion and then more broadly to the floor. And both of these have come up already in the discussion. One is this question of not moving too fast to elections. But if so, how do you still get there? How do you build forward for elections, and how do you avoid the problem of slow progress to elections being used as an excuse not to have any progress at all? And I wanted to put that to my colleagues because I think this is beginning to get us into this practical area of what it is we actually do and do together in many cases.
I'll come to the defense of elections because I think elections have taken it on the chin in recent years.
I didn't say we shouldn't do them.
And both Lorne and I are in a task force on the prevention of genocide, and one of the discussions on one of the draft papers.
I am too.
You're in a different group, I think.
No, I'm in the plenary.
Okay, you're in the plenary. But in one of the draft papers, it listed all the things, all the plagues, all the things that could create tensions and that could lead to conflict, that ultimately could lead to mass atrocities and then genocide. And in all the terrible things, ethnic rivalries, killings, elections were listed as one of the things that can lead to, ultimately, to genocide. And I said, well, I could make the argument a lack of elections could also lead to tensions. In South Africa, the lack of elections, I think, over the years, I don't think anyone would wanted to subscribe to it. I don't think there would have been a peace agreement in Mozambique or the Rome Agreement or a peace agreement in Sierra Leone or El Salvador if there had not been the prospect of elections. And as I said, in Pakistan, the only way to come out of this crisis was through an electoral process. And as Lorne said, democracy does not equal democracy. But we have to recognize that people are going to demand the right to choose their elected leaders. In Iraq, no one was pushing elections. And until Sistani woke up one morning and said, we're going to have elections. And all of a sudden, we were scrambling around to organize for an electoral process. In the West Bank, it wasn't that there were too many elections, that there wasn't enough elections. The elections that brought Hamas to power was supposed to be the third election since 1996. And perhaps if there had been more regular elections, Fatah would have got a less severe message delivered to them by the Palestinians. Ultimately, I think we have to recognize in this interdependent world that people are going to make those demands. And we have to be ready to try to the best of our ability to assist those to organize electoral processes that ultimately reflect the will of the people and are be accepted by the people. But the notion that the international community will tell a population that they have to wait for some undetermined period of time before they have that right, I think is not sustainable. And so I think in all the places that we work, we have to be prepared to engage citizens, engage governments, the electoral authorities, the judiciary, the media, political parties, civil society, to organize the best we can processes that provide legitimacy to governments. I have never heard anybody give an alternative to a legitimately elected government that can provide the authority that enables it to carry on fundamental economic security and political policies.
But we are to some extent circling around a problem that is maybe not the center. I mean, we're all agreed that you can't refuse elections. And I think your paper makes the point that it's not just about rushing to elections. But I'd like to get you to focus a little more on that middle ground of, great, you needed an election in Pakistan, you're correct, but the election hasn't gotten you out of a problem. We could have been perhaps doing more things, and we can still do a lot. How do we deal with better conditions for elections and sustaining what comes after them?
I think as far as sustaining what comes after them, we need to have, like I've said, more of a recognition that elections don't equal democracy. If you're able to cast a ballot every 4 years, but in between you can't feed the children, you don't have a job, and there's no groceries on the shelf, democracy doesn't look so good. If you can't turn the lights on at night, or the garbage doesn't get collected, democracy doesn't look so good. So I think it's incumbent on us in particular in our assistance not to just lurch from election to election and suddenly raise the assistance a year before an election, but to understand in between that we need to be helping to better conditions in the country so people actually see material benefits from democracy. And like I said, it's not just about being able to cast a ballot every 4 years.
In Cambodia, for example, UNTAG spent, about $2 to $3 billion on elections and then packed their bags and left the day after the elections.
So embedding elections in a much more holistic strategy for both development and social preparation. Then how do you, just to do one more question before we open it up, when you have elected governments which are coalitions, which depend on a very, not simple coalitions of a couple of parties, but coalitions of a whole lot of interests, you often have a situation of great instability and really of inability to make any decisions because somebody's ox is going to be gored and there are so many conflicting power centers you can't bring them together. Any prescriptions that you want to throw on the table either to avoid that kind of situation or to deal with it, going back to your point that if you have to deliver economically, if you have political stasis, you don't make decisions, you don't deliver. So how do we approach this both before and after elections?
Well, I would say one of the important things to do, first of all, is to recognize this is not just a problem in new democracies. I can think of at least three, just off the top of my head, countries, developed democracies that are in political stasis right now because they have such coalitions. But I would also say it's important for us in our work to focus. Many of the countries we deal with, I recall the first Russian election in 1993 where they had 64 parties, including the beer drinkers party. There's one country we're working in now that has 50 parties, and one of the efforts we need to make is to help people realize the common goals that they have based on substantive platforms, not on their personalities, to be able to come together. And I think both we and NDI in a lot of countries have been able to work on that kind of coalition building that is not only about bringing a dozen or 8 parties together so it's going to be unstable afterwards, but bringing them more together under a party banner than they have been in the past. I think it's a very valid question.
I would add something to which we talked about before, and this goes to the international community more broadly, and that is being there is important. And using the convening power that the international community often has in these societies is to create settings that allow to bring people together that normally would not come under their own accord.
You did that very skillfully in Bahrain, where you were able to work with groups that wouldn't work in the parliament.
Right, but I do believe the notion of using the convening power. I think it is also important in these situations to recognize that this is an ongoing process, that the resources have to be dedicated to understand that most of the processes that we're talking about are political processes. When building legislatures, and there have been many studies that show the strength of democracies depend in large measure on the ability of parliaments to function and to operate effectively, that these are political institutions. These are not government ministries. So computerized voting systems and large infrastructure assistance is not going to make a parliament. You have to work with it as a political institution. Elections are not just about ballot boxes and ballot papers, as important as those technical issues are, but it's also about the ability of citizens to participate in the process and parties to compete and citizens to oversee the process, the judiciary to handle complaints. These are fundamentally political processes, and in many cases we have to approach these as political institutions and political processes, and that's working primarily with politicians and not simply civil society and state institutions.
And I think that's a fascinating point because it touches on an area where we have often worked, that is, we, the diplomats, and the NGOs have worked, I think, very well together, but very quietly, which is, on the diplomatic side, often maintaining uneasy support of governments for the work of NGOs to act in this convening manner, to recognize that the democracy NGOs are not the enemy, but in fact are a source of helping to move forward for stability. And I would say on the side of the NGOs, I've seen it in some countries, really brilliant efforts to get very opposed politicians to see that they have common interests, the convening power you were talking about, because one thing that has certainly struck me over the years is that a great deal of what we think of as intuitive behavior is in fact absolutely not intuitive in many other cultures. The whole idea of a compromise to achieve something is a fundamentally foreign idea to people who have grown up in a power-based, sort of zero-based society, which you either have power or you don't have power. And the idea that if you have power, you should give up some of it to achieve something. The learning curve is phenomenal. So we got a lot of work to do. Now, having said that, let's open it up to questions. I would ask that you, first, wait for the mic. Second, identify yourself, identify your organization. If you don't have an organization, you can instantly incorporate yourself from the floor. Sir.
What about the question of faith? I'm not talking...
Would you identify yourself?
My name is Carl Carter. I'm General Counsel for the Universal Human Rights Network. And what comes to mind was the stunned reaction in the West to see lawyers demonstrating for the reappointment of judges, and the belief that the state could not, once those men held those positions, that institution represented something more as part of the democratic process. And that's what I'm talking about. how do you preserve the faith in not the process, not elections, but in the institutions which create the whole? And in doing so, create the groundwork that is necessary to bring forward a belief that this is a system of government that can work.
Well, while you think about it, I'm going to make one quick statement, and that is that I recognize this is an extraordinarily hard problem, and it is harder because people don't start easily with the faith, and they don't start easily by believing that anything you say about what you're going to create is true. In fact, since I've worked in mostly the benighted countries of the East that don't have democracies, I would say people have a very low regard for anything you say. They look to actions. So part of the answer, I suspect, is going to be that this is an accretion over time, and then what you do in a crisis is going to be critical. That you either cement the faith in your reaction when a crisis comes, or you lose it and probably can't get it back.
Yeah, you can look back at our own history here over 200 years ago when they debated how long the term of a House member should be, and there were those that had argued at the time that a member should, once that member received the confidence of the electorate in his or his district, that was enough, and he should serve for life. And on the other side, led by Elbridge Gerry, who argued that a member should only serve for a one-year term because he forgets from whence he came in that city of sin so far away. And he didn't even have a city to be talking about at the time. But there was a recognition that people would not have faith in government. Then they debated 9 months, and they came down to a two-year term for a member of the House. So there has been a breach in faith, I think, in a political system. And if you look at the polls that have been conducted, world value surveys and others, they show that people want democratic institutions and processes in every country around the world. But when you ask about those issues of faith, who do they trust? Generally speaking, they only trust their families, religious leaders, and the people immediately around them. And I think that so much of the work that we try to do is to try to connect citizens with elected leaders, providing mechanisms, whether it's at local level or the national level, to ensure that politicians reach out to citizens, and citizens, and what the World Bank would call social accountability, that citizens have the capacity to deal in advocacy, to meet with their elected officials on a regular basis, and use, again, the convening power to provide avenues for this type of interaction. And I think only over time, recognizing that there's not going to be a great deal of faith, but at least that there's going to be a sense that government is there to represent you, even while at the same time, and we have the same problem here on the issue of faith, at the same time it doesn't reach a proportion where it threatens the stability of the society or the democratic process.
We do a lot of, just to follow on to what Ken said about avenues for redress, one of the avenues we have taken advantage of a lot is polling. A lot of, even my board members say, why do you do so much polling? It's horse race stuff. You're just taking a snapshot of the race at this or that point. But what we use the polling for is to go back to political parties before an election to say you can run on what you want to run on. And here I think of the example we worked in the late 90s in Slovakia, where the Democratic opposition to Vladimir Mečiar was telling us, we know what people want. They want to join NATO and the EU. Democratic opposition was largely kind of a coffee house crowd from Bratislava. And we said, in traveling around the country, we hear differently. We don't hear much talk about the NATO and EU. We hear a lot of talk about economic issues, about education, about housing, et cetera. And they looked at us and they said, well, you're Americans. You don't know our country. We don't buy that. And we said, well, let us do some polling. And we asked people to rate issues from 1 to 10, 1 being the most important, what they cared about. NATO and EU came out number 9 and number 10. And we went back to the opposition and we said, you can run on whatever you want, and we're not going to tell you how to solve these first state problems, these basically economic and pocketbook issues. But if you don't come up with solutions, you will lose the election. And they decided to come up with solutions. to those issues, and they went on to win the election. One thing we have done after people get in, and I think this is maybe the most important answer to your question, and to take again off what Ken said about avenues, is to continue to do polling, to show the government the issues that people care about. And in a number of countries, the folks who have been elected have an understanding that they're there to solve people's problems. And they can talk about whatever they want, but if they're not solving the issues that people care about, not only are people going to get cynical about democracy, they're going to throw them out. And I think here of, a country that we certainly would not associate in any way with democracy, but where in fact there at the local level there has come to be some, China, village elections. We have been engaged since the mid-1990s. I think IRI was the first Western NGO ever to see a village election in China. We have now seen successive elections in some of the same villages. And what we have found is that the Chinese people, who really haven't had much experience in their whole history with democracy, have come to understand what elections are about. That if I elect this person and they don't do anything for the village, then we're going to throw them out. If I elect him or her and water gets piped up to the village or a new road gets built or something like that, I'll re-elect them. So I think people get it rather quickly. But it's all about, as we've said, creating those avenues, different methods for rulers to understand what the rules want.
We never knew we should have organized the Chicago war dealers into an NGO
Exactly.
and go forth to teach. I've got two questions here. First, a refugee from Russia and a lady behind her.
My name is Scott Carpenter. I'm with the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, and I want to ask Lorne and Ken both a question that I get asked all the time. And since I'm sure your answers are much better than mine, I'm hoping to crib off of them. Come on. Isn't it promoting democracy is a great thing, except when it's not in American national interest to do so? How is it in American national interest to promote democracy, for instance, in the Middle East, where all of our friends there happen to be autocratic and they are, for better or worse, keeping the lid on there? So how would you answer that argument?
What was the second one? Did you have a second
No,
one?
that's it.
No, that's the one you get hit on. Okay. You can go with that one.
Go ahead.
My answer would be to look at what happens if we don't try to promote more pluralism and democracy within the society. That doesn't mean we immediately need to move to elections in Saudi Arabia. But if you do not create avenues for political redress and political access in these countries that are civil, then people take up uncivil methods to have their problems redressed. If you look at the backgrounds of the leadership of organizations like Al-Qaeda, by and large, the leadership does not come out of impoverished backgrounds. They're all quite well educated. What you find out is that they, one way or another, they all think they have been victims of repression. And certainly the lower level, the lower level people within those organizations, some of them are more impoverished, but they all have in common poor education, poor access to the political system, etc. In any region, you would not want to have that happen, to have what happened, say, in a place like Iran over time, because I don't think that has served our interests either. But you certainly do not want to have that happen in the Middle East.
I would go back to a point I made in my introductory remarks, too, that you can be so tied that you are then tied like you're tied to a rock sinking into the sea when the regime itself sinks. And Pakistan is now a very large example of this, that as Musharraf plummeted, we stayed with him into the plummet. And it is now extraordinarily difficult for us to build a popular support for the aid to counterinsurgency that we want. That's not a simple answer for how do you do it better, but it's a very strong answer, I think, for it is not just in our interest to stay with people as they crash.
I would say in the Pakistan issue, since the 1999 coup, we pursued stability at the expense of democracy, and we achieved neither in the last decade. And our position in Pakistan and our standing in Pakistan has plummeted as a result of that. And now we look back at that and said, even the hard-nosed realists said we should have been pushing these issues a long time ago. And if you look at the support for the more radical elements in Pakistan, the popularity of most of the more radical elements in the political spectrum rose dramatically under the Musharraf regime. I think that, I go back to this whole notion about these two extremes that exist in these societies. I go back in another place and another time in places like the Philippines and Chile, and I see this symbiotic relationship that has existed between these two extremes. And the status quo only means that these extremes will grow, and everything between them gets squeezed out in the process. And if you don't open this process and allow something to emerge between those extremes, and even if it takes short-term risks and medium-term risks, the alternatives are all worse. And eventually, what is going to happen from those tensions and the growth of these extremist elements on both sides is going to be an explosion, and that's going to be detrimental to the interests of the society and ultimately to our interests as well.
It really focuses the need for a much more articulated dialogue on how we do better in the middle. That to trap ourselves into this dialogue, into this alternatives, stability or democracy, is really a Hobson's choice. You come out badly on both. You certainly come out badly the way we're doing it. You probably come out badly when you rush forward to transform things faster than people are asking you for. And in any event, you probably can't in most cases. So there's a huge demand that we're not managing to get out into the public discussion for a lot more focus on how we work in the middle ground, how we put, what are the policies we could have used to push the problem solving that you're both talking about in a Musharraf regime before we got to the point where we were making these kind of decisions. And it's not just about, if you're not having elections, we're going to either shoot you or sanction you. We got to find a better way to deal with this. There was another question right behind.
If I can just finish off on that one, if I can. To go back to this example of the Philippines and Chile, these were two countries where we had a great relationship, great security relationship. We had our two biggest bases in the world at Clark and Subic, and we lost both of those. I have no doubt that Pinochet, were he still in power, would have sent troops to Iraq. But is that all that we ask of a relationship with a country? And I would argue that our relationship with both countries is much healthier and much more holistic than it was then. I think by and large in many countries over the past couple of years, we pursued a pretty good policy of trying to work the middle. There are obvious exceptions. Pakistan is one. I think Central Asia is another. But I think the golden rule is something Colin Powell talked about in his biography about his trip to Iran in 1978, where he talks about being taken around by an Iranian general to see I think it was called the Peacock Brigade, something like that. And he was told by the Iranian general, these are the Shah's best troops. They will never defect. They will be with him till the end, no matter what happens. And he came back and he said he was watching TV about 4 or 5 months later, and there was a picture of the general on a slab in a morgue in Tehran, and he said the Peacock Brigade had defected on the very first day of the revolution. And he said the mistake we made in Iran was tying our fortunes to a person, not a people. And he said, because of that, we have earned ourselves a lasting enmity, 2 generations of enmity from the Iranian people. And I think that may be the golden rule of the mistake not to make.
Thanks. Michelle Kellerman with National Public Radio. I want to ask about the campaign trail, because all of you have talked about how democracy promotion has gotten a bad name. What can the next president do to restore America's credibility? And do you hear different approaches coming from John McCain and Barack Obama on this issue?
Well, you guys have positions from which to deal with this.
I don't think either organization is engaged in the political campaign here. And so therefore, I'm not going to say anything that will even hint at partisanship. But I do believe you have two candidates that are internationalists, and two candidates who believe in American leadership in the role. I think you have candidates that believe that the United States has to work with others. There has to be continued American leadership, but it's also American leadership by working with others cooperatively. And the need to perhaps increase our commitment, financial commitment, and human resources to our role around the world. And so I think to some degree in enhancing our standing and reputation in the world, a lot will be with tone, a lot will be with action, a lot will be with the perception that the United States is listening and caring to what others think. But at the same time, I think regardless of who's going to win, they're going to ask a lot of others. And so there's going to have to be reciprocity here. It's going to be the ability to work with others and create a tone that others see that they are being listened to. And it's also, they are going to have to understand in places like Afghanistan, there's going to be a lot asked of others to engage in this process. So I'm optimistic because you have two candidates that believe in working cooperatively with the rest of the world. And I think over time, and as Iraq recedes from dominating the international debate over the course of the next 4 years, I think that in and of itself will improve relationships.
You know, I've found it very interesting. In both parties, I think you could have ended up with candidates who are not as interested in foreign policy as these two are. And I think it says a lot about Americans, especially after 9/11, that the system has produced two unexpected candidates, both of whom are committed internationally and have a great interest in foreign policy. You know, in talking to people from overseas, and most particularly, I think Europe is where we've taken a lot of criticism over the past few years. There's a fascination, I think, with both for different reasons. But I think there's also an understanding, first of all, from Europeans that relations are going to get better. There's also an understanding among the more sophisticated Europeans that multilateralism also means that everybody has to play a role. You know, I think it was Henry Kissinger and Der Spiegel who said the Europeans aren't going to be able to hide behind George Bush anymore. And I think both candidates, whoever is elected, is going to be engaging in multilateralism, but with an understanding that every multilateral partner has a role to play. And we certainly hope they will be playing it.
I think there's an enormous desire in the international community for the United States to play a constructive role in these areas. I think we have a huge amount to work with, and that'll be true whoever is the next president. Then what will count is what you do with that reservoir of willingness in a fairly short period. Sir, right. Wait for the mic, please. And then do identify yourself.
Good afternoon. My name is Puneet Ahluwalia. I work with George Allen, JF, George Allen Strategies. What I've recognized, being from India, that all power corrupts. And
that's what Lord Acton said. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
That's what Lord Acton said, yes.
Yes, and it takes time to get the democracy to blossom. And had it not been the assassination of Mrs. Gandhi, we would not have democracy today, because Rajiv Gandhi, who was tutored in a foreign country, and he understood the meaning of democracy, and the Hindu party, which came into power. But what I feel is that if we focus on multi-party system, and we keep and initiate the dialogue at every level, be it they might not understand democracy, the word of democracy at present point, but in the future they would. On the other hand, catching them young, because we are all used to dynastic rules. rulers, like, for example, the Gandhi family has ruled, and the Benazir Bhutto family has been in power because her father was there and having a Muslim lady leading a Muslim nation. If we catch Bilal and the young ones as Mrs. Gandhi's son and talk to them about democracy, talk to about what the United States stand for and believe in, we catch them young and we're able to change their ideology and we change the future of their nation. I think that's one possible way of doing it. And so is most of these kids are tutored in London or Europe or the US. So this is what my question was. Do we catch them young? Do we talk and dialogue with the multi-party system, because we had all our eggs in one basket with Musharraf? Did we talk to Benazir Bhutto or with Nawaz Sharif so that the dialogue was on for the democracy to survive?
Well, I think there's something to what you say. If you look at the Middle East, for example, if you look at the countries where they have had democratic process, I think Owen Kirby 10 years ago wrote an article called Want Democracy, Get a King. And his point in the Middle East was that if you looked at the republics, they were not advancing. They were not making themselves more open systems politically. Oddly, if you looked at the monarchies were the only ones that were opening. Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Morocco, who else on? Kuwait, et cetera, the ones who were opening up politically. So I think there is something to that. And by and large, these were young leaders, with the exception of the Sultan of Oman, who had been educated overseas. I think a good recent example of this is Hun Sen's son from Cambodia, who came here. A lot of people, including myself, protested when he came to West Point. But apparently he's become a very open advocate to his father of a more open political system. I would also say, however, that it's incumbent, on the countries and certainly on us in talking to them to try and get beyond this dynastic succession business. We undertook a mission in a country where we were told by one political party, yes, we have a lot of internal democracy. We've just elected our leader for life. And it was somebody who was somebody's daughter. So it's important, I think, in these countries for us to emphasize, and this is one of the biggest things we do in any country, is talk about not the politics of personality. That is not what is going to advance things in a country, or certainly the politics of dynastic succession, but the politics of issues. That it's not always healthy to be on the second, third, fourth generation of a family leading a party or leading a country. And you can see this in a number of places. Syria is a great example. Azerbaijan is another example. Whatever you thought of the fathers, sometimes the sons aren't nearly as talented.
More questions, or have we worn you out? One right here. And then Julie.
Hi, Brett O'Brien with the Glover Park Group. Ken, I thought in your opening remarks, you pointed to one word that I think we haven't really talked about too much, and that's the word patience. The need for patience when doing the kind of work that you and Lorne and your organizations are doing. In Washington, we've got a lot of problem solvers, whether on Capitol Hill or political appointees or opinion leaders that want to change things, impose sanctions, or require things to happen in certain countries on a very fast time frame sometimes. The political process here demands that at times. How do you work with that dynamic here when needing to kind of maintain a patient approach to democracy promotion?
You have to be patient.
You've hit on an important side. I mean, there is an attitude here in terms of programs that everyone wants a quarterly dividend. And funders want results and results-oriented. And there's always a danger in these types of approaches that you're almost forced to try to take credit for the development of other people's institutions. So it looks as though you're taking ownership of other people's institutions. And when I first came to Washington, and I was a lobbyist during the 1970s, my first boss always said, stand behind legislation, never in front of it. Because if you don't, you're going to lose fundamental trust. And I think for the work that we do and others like us, both here and in other countries, standing behind people, not in front of them, is very important. We are supporting actors in all of this. We are not the primary actors. So it does take time, and that's true in terms of the expenditure of resources as well. These institution building and developing processes do take a long time. Sometimes we put too much faith in individuals, and it's not surprisingly that people are more democratic than opposition than they are in government. And we tend to become disappointed. But when we're talking about policy change, when we're talking about human change, behavioral change, when you're talking about institution building, these things take a long time. At the same time, things should not be glacial. My chairman, Madeleine Albright, talks about gradual change, but not glacial change, because there is also a tendency in some of these countries to say it's going to take generations, and it's going to take a long time. And my response is usually, yes, that's why you have to begin now. And what you do now is going to determine the pace and nature of reform. But the question is, how does it move? And it requires, I think, steady resources and a recognition that these are long-term institution buildings. And then at particular moments, there are moments where you can have, I think, an important impact on events in a positive way. But it's all about relationships with people. It's building trust with people, and being able to operate on a long-term basis and not assume that people are going to graduate overnight. And recognize that this is not a linear process, that you can have progress and all of a sudden you can have regression in places too. We constantly quote John F. Kennedy, who says democracy is not a final achievement, it's a call to an untiring effort, and it really is a long-term effort in these countries. It's an argument we make, and I think there are some many who understand it here. But we recognize there are limited resources, and there are a lot of pressures on a lot of people to demonstrate, particularly to Capitol Hill and other places, that these programs are worthwhile and they're making a contribution. And it's always a balance in trying to deal with these issues.
I think this is a particular problem with the U.S. I mean, I think one of the problems we had in Haiti in the 90s was, we would go into a country like that, and 3 years later, Americans would look around and say, we spent $100 million and they don't look like us. How come? Why do they still have problems in this country? We spent a lot of money here. The kind of countries where we work are on 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30-year horizons for democracy. But I think the point is movement. When I was at State Department, I used to often get asked, well, how, we're a pretty repressive country. How are we going to show you that we're moving? And my answer was, show some movement. We're not comparing you overnight to Switzerland. What we're looking for is some changes in your country. But I would say also it's incumbent on us as in the kind of work we do as NGOs to be able to describe what year 5 would look like, what year 10 would look like, what year 15 would look like. If you're trying to get from A to Z, what does C look like? What does M look like? What does P look like? And then understand that, as was said, it's not going to be a linear progression. Just as we have had advances and fallbacks in our country, you're going to see that overseas. But the point is to see movement.
We don't do that. Exactly what you're talking about, describing the interval.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that well
no,
with the government.
not at
I
all.
mean, I've seen, thousands of policy papers which say, here's a problem, and here's a set of steps that are part of a solution. I would not need all the fingers on one hand, I believe, to count the number of papers that have said, and this is how much this buys you and over what period of time and what you should expect to see. We're great at talking about long-term, and we're miserable about defining what long-term means, so that it sets us up for criticism, because we don't temper expectations very well by our presentations. I think we could just work in one more question if I shut up and my colleagues have short answers.
Julia Chang-Block, U.S.-China Education Trust. I'm interested in the tools of promoting democracy, and I'm curious whether any of you think there is a connection between public diplomacy and democracy promotion. And if you do you think that the serious decline of U.S. public diplomacy efforts has had a negative impact on our democracy promotion efforts?
Okay. Let me just say two things. And it's the title of this of this paper, and we always use it, but I have to admit I hate the word promoting. Because it conjures up this image that we are exporting something to others and we're bringing something here to other people. We find all over the world we're doing a lot of responding and very little promoting. And I think people don't recognize, particularly people who sit in this capital and don't spend a lot of time on the ground around the countries, that there are people are engaged in this struggle. In non-democratic countries, in fledgling democracies, events are taking place, people are acting, and the question ultimately is do we respond? And if we do respond, how do we respond in these situations? And so, Carlos Andrés Pérez, when he was president of Venezuela, gave a speech to the OAS following the stolen elections in Panama. And he said, against the non-intervention clause of the OAS, and he says non-intervention is a form of intervention on behalf of non-democratic forces in societies. So I just wanted to make that point. On Julia, on the other thing, I'm sorry, you wanted to know about the public. I tend to separate the two, and I think the goals of the two are very, very different. I do happen to believe if we're engaged in this type of work, it helps the image of the United States. But if we start linking democracy promotion activities to public diplomacy, which is designed to win over in a very, very direct way people to American policies, then we tend to subvert democracy promotion efforts. So I think the two ought to be separated with the knowledge, I think, that over the long term, we serve the interests of the United States and we serve the image of the United States by supporting the notion of democratic processes and institutions. But when they're brought together, I think it undermines both.
Two stories real quick. Early in the Bush administration, I think there were some efforts at public diplomacy, and I'm trying to remember the subject of the VHS videos, I think, was how well Muslims live together or something like that here in the United States. And a lot of these VHS tapes were sent overseas, and there was a certain ambassador who said to me, please stop these from coming because we've run out of landfill to put them in. I was in another country, not in the Middle East, this one was in Central Asia, and I was, we were going to the Central Asia University, it was up in Kyrgyzstan, and we were told by the ambassador going in, they're really going to take it out of you when you walk into this classroom. You're going to finish your presentations, and then they're going to hammer you on Iraq and Afghanistan and this, that, and the other. And Beth Jones and I walked in the room. She was Assistant Secretary for Europe at the time. And when we walked out, about 45 minutes later, they had not laid a glove on us. And the reason was that we were going over right afterwards to open a printing press. President Akayev's son owned the only printing press in the country, and on a lot of days, a lot of newspapers didn't get printed. All these students wanted to know about was why we had done that. And I walked out and I said to Beth, we could have spent millions of dollars on public diplomacy in these countries, sending those VHS tapes here to no end. But I think that project cost $750,000. We got a lot of public diplomacy mileage today. So I think where where your deeds, as opposed to your words, show what you really think, that's the best kind of public diplomacy.
I just wanted to add that it comes right in on Lorne's comment. That while I agree with Ken that we can hurt ourselves if we appear to be pushing things at people too much, it is vital that our public diplomacy explain what we are doing, but that we do what we're explaining. That much of the world, America's not that believing a culture as to what's on the media waves, and most of the world is, or much of it, has grown up in cultures where media is manipulated and where you learn virtually from birth that you look to actions rather than to words to try to determine what people are really doing and what governments are really doing. And so it is incredibly important that we explain what we are doing, but that we not talk about things we're not doing, because what we do is to destroy our credibility and undermine what we're trying to do. So I think there is a linkage, but I don't think I'm really in opposition to Ken. I do think, however, that we've run out of time. Am I correct? Thank you very much for hosting this. David, would you like to say some concluding remarks? I'm terribly grateful to have been asked to join you, and I thought we had a great audience, great questions, and it was great fun to be back with my colleagues. And I think you've all been a great audience, so I think you should give yourselves a hand.